Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Brazilian prison gangs. It's a pretty heavy topic, but you've given us some fascinating sources here: news reports, documentaries, even a glimpse into this really unique prison reform program.
Yeah, and it's amazing how these sources don't just show us violence and chaos, but they actually show us a complex system, right? Where these gangs, they wield power both inside and outside prison walls. It's
Yeah,
almost like a parallel society in a way.
exactly. It's almost like a shadow state. So let's unpack this a little. First, we got to start with the sheer scale of Brazil's prison crisis, right? One source mentioned the system is a staggering 229,000 places. So what are some of the immediate consequences of such overcrowding?
Yeah, you can really see it in the sources, the horrific conditions, tiny cells crammed with inmates, violence is just kind of constantly simmering under the surface. One video even showed a corpse being thrown from a rooftop. It's a system really on the verge of collapse. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a breeding ground, right?
Yeah.
Beyond just human suffering, how does this chaos give rise to organizations like the PCC, the First Capital Command?
Well, the PCC is a prime example of how gangs exploit these failings. They started in that notorious Carandiru prison, demanding better treatment after the 1992 massacre, where police killed over 100 inmates. Initially, they advocated for peace, justice, liberty. It's almost ironic,
Right.
considering how they later evolved.
Right. It's a jarring contrast going from prisoner rights to a powerful drug cartel.
Yeah.
Their motto is life is paid with life, blood is paid with blood. And that's not about peaceful reforms, is it? What shift happened internally, would you say?
Well, they filled this power vacuum in a system where the state really lacks control and is rife with corruption. The PCC offers protection, they'll resolve disputes, but they enforce a very brutal code of conduct. They
Yeah.
essentially become the authority where the state fails.
It's fascinating and terrifying at the same time. And their organization is incredible. One source detailed how they actually function like a corporation. They manage finances, they keep these meticulous records on members, and orchestrate attacks outside prison walls. This isn't just some disorganized gang anymore.
No, it's not. They're very sophisticated in their structure, and they've been linked to a whole range of criminal activities, including this incredibly audacious bank heist in Paraguay.
Right.
They used speedboats and military-grade weaponry to escape.
$8 million stolen using speedboats to escape. It sounds like something out of a movie. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back inside the prisons. How do these gangs, how do they maintain order in such overcrowded, understaffed facilities?
Well, it's a disturbing reality, but in a lot of cases, they are the order. Our sources actually show instances like the Central Prison Complex in Porto Alegre, where gangs actually control different wings. They enforce their own set of rules and even offer services like lawyers or family visits,
Wow.
all for a fee, of course.
Right. So it's like this distorted reflection of the legitimate system, right? Like they offer what the state should be providing, but on their terms and with their own brand of justice. But isn't that just empowering them, letting them strengthen their grip on the prison population?
Yeah, it's a dangerous trade-off, right? Because authorities are relying on gangs for some semblance of control, but this just fuels the cycle. This chaos benefits the PCC. It allows them to really entrench themselves and expand their criminal networks beyond the prison walls.
It's a troubling dilemma. And we see the violence, the intricate organization, even the influence reaching beyond Brazil's borders. But before we dive into those global implications, let's shift gears for a moment. Let's talk about a potential counter-narrative here, the APAC system.
Ah, yes, the APAC system. This offers a very stark contrast to the brutal reality we've been discussing. It's a prison reform program. It prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment. One source showed us an APAC prison where, get this, inmates have responsibilities, they receive education, and they can even walk outside the prison walls.
That's incredible. It's a radical departure from those overcrowded, violent prisons that we've seen. No guards, a focus on self-governance, personal growth. It's almost hard to believe it's a prison. What are some of the key operational details that make this system so different and seemingly effective?
Well, the structure is really fascinating. Instead of guards, they actually have recovered inmates who are mentoring newcomers. Their rehabilitation programs can range from psychological counseling to even vocational training. And the funding model relies heavily on the inmate's own labor. This creates a sense of ownership and responsibility.
Welcome back to our deep dive. This APAC model really shows just how broken the traditional system is. It's striking, but APAC offers hope. We can't forget the PCC is still out there. and they're not just standing still. So what is it that fuels their growth beyond those prison walls?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've talked about how incredibly organized they are. But organization alone doesn't really explain their power. One thing that comes up in the sources over and over again is their involvement in the drug trade. How does that play into their rise? Well, Brazil is a major cocaine transit country, and the PCC, they've seized control of some really key trafficking routes, particularly in the Amazon. And, the sources that we've seen, they really highlight these brutal turf wars that they have with rival gangs vying for control of this multi-billion-dollar industry.
Right, so it's not just about controlling prisons, it's about controlling territory and resources. The Amazon is vast and difficult to police, so that probably plays right into their hands, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's the rainforest's remoteness. It provides ideal conditions for these criminal networks to thrive. It's the perfect storm, really. Weak law enforcement, huge profit potential. And it's not just a domestic issue, right? Our sources showed evidence of the PCC smuggling cocaine to Africa and Europe.
Wow, that's scary. It's a reminder that this isn't just a Brazilian problem, it's got global repercussions. What kind of an impact does this have on the communities caught in the crossfire?
The human cost is immense. You have innocent people getting caught in the crossfire. Communities are terrorized by gang violence. And then you have the environmental devastation, from the illegal mining, deforestation, all to fund these operations. It's a very heartbreaking situation.
Yeah, it's this tragic cycle, right? The drug trade fuels the growth of prison gangs, which then destabilizes communities and undermines the rule of law. It just perpetuates this cycle of poverty and violence.
It's a very complex web of interconnected issues, that's for sure. And while APAC shows a lot of promise, it's really a drop in the bucket compared to the vastness of this problem. So what is the Brazilian government doing to actually counter the PCC's influence?
Yeah, that's a million-dollar question, isn't it? We've seen reports of increased police presence in affected areas, crackdowns on drug trafficking routes, even attempts to dismantle gang leadership structures. But some sources really question the long-term effectiveness of these kinds of tactics.
Yeah, that's definitely a valid concern. There's a huge debate about whether just focusing on law enforcement really addresses the root causes or if it just displaces the problem and potentially fuels more violence.
Yeah. Some people argue that these crackdowns just create a vacuum that a new, maybe even more violent group will fill.
Exactly. It's like playing whack-a-mole. You suppress one faction, another one pops up, and solely focusing on law enforcement ignores those crucial social and economic factors that drive people to join gangs in the first place.
So what's the alternative then? How do you actually tackle the poverty, the inequality, the lack of opportunity that makes gang recruitment so effective?
Well, it requires a multifaceted approach, right? Investing in education, job training programs, social support systems, create viable alternatives to a life of crime. Remember Charles McDuffie, that Vietnam veteran we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
His story really highlights the need for mental health resources, especially for people who've experienced trauma.
Right. His journey towards seeking redemption and finding solace in therapy, that's a powerful example of how important mental health services are.
Right.
And let's not forget Crystal Tribble, the teenager who got caught in that cycle of incarceration. Her story really underlines the need for early intervention programs and a more effective juvenile justice system.
Absolutely. It's about investing in people, not just prisons. To break the cycle, it requires more than just punitive measures. It demands a shift toward rehabilitation and reintegration into society. APAC, with its emphasis on personal growth and responsibility, I think really points in the right direction.
It's definitely a long-term strategy. Requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to experiment with different approaches. But the alternative, letting these trends just continue, it's too dire to contemplate, isn't it?
Yeah. The future of Brazil, its people, its communities, it really hinges on finding effective solutions to this crisis. And it's not just a domestic issue. As the PCC expands globally, the stakes just get higher, demanding international cooperation and a really coordinated response.
That's true. It's a daunting task. But the sources we've explored show that there are dedicated individuals and organizations out there working tirelessly to make a difference. They offer, I think, a glimmer of hope amidst all this darkness. Their stories are inspiring and offer valuable lessons for how we can tackle this very complex issue.
Yeah, I agree. They remind us that change is possible, even in some of the darkest places. They highlight the importance of persistence, innovation, and a belief in the possibility of redemption. So whether it's advocating for policy changes, supporting rehabilitation programs, or simply just raising awareness, every effort contributes to building a better future.
Yeah. Their dedication is truly inspiring. So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's carry these insights with us and explore what the future might hold for Brazil and its battle against these prison gangs. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've gone pretty deep into the reality of Brazil's prison gangs, their rise to power, the impact they have inside and outside prison walls. We've also seen glimmers of hope, right? People and organizations fighting for change, innovative approaches like the APAC system. So where do we go from here? What does the future hold for Brazil and its battle against these powerful criminal networks?
Well, predicting the future is always a challenge, right? But I think we can at least look at potential scenarios based on what we've learned from these sources. Let's start with maybe the most optimistic outcome. What would a positive future actually look like for Brazil?
Yeah, let's try to paint that picture. What needs to happen for Brazil to really turn the tide, to create a more just and secure society?
Well, it would require a pretty multifaceted approach, tackling both the symptoms and the root causes. Imagine Brazil implements these comprehensive reforms, invests heavily in education, job training, social programs to alleviate poverty, really provide opportunities, especially for young people who are the most vulnerable to gang recruitment.
Right. Creating a path forward, giving people a chance to actually build a life rather than being lured into criminal activity. But what about the people already caught in this system? What would a reformed prison system look like?
I think rehabilitation would have to be a top priority. Expanding those programs like APAC, with their focus on growth, responsibility, reintegration into society, that could be huge. And really addressing the stigma of being a former inmate, making it easier for them to get jobs and rebuild their lives.
So, a two-pronged approach. Break the cycle of poverty that leads to gang recruitment, and reform the prison system to focus on rehabilitation, not just punishment. It's a hopeful vision. But what if things go in the other direction? What's the worst-case scenario here?
The worst case is we see these trends continue, maybe even escalate. Overcrowding gets worse. The violence spirals out of control. Gangs like the PCC tighten their grip on prisons and the drug trade, and their influence just seeps deeper into society, potentially even corrupting government institutions.
It's a grim picture. A descent into lawlessness, where gangs basically operate with impunity, further destabilizing the country, undermining the rule of law. And as we said, this isn't just a domestic problem, right? What are the global implications if the PCC continues to expand unchecked?
Well, they already have a presence in Africa and Europe. A more powerful PCC could be a very real threat to regional and even global security, facilitating drug trafficking, money laundering, maybe even terrorism. It's a scary thought.
It is. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for Brazil, but for the world. But realistically, it's unlikely that things will swing drastically in either direction. Is there a middle ground, a more plausible scenario that's somewhere between those extremes?
Probably. Brazil will likely see a mix of progress and setbacks. Some reforms will succeed, others might falter. The fight against the gangs will continue. There will be victories and defeats. It's going to be a long and difficult process. It's going to require sustained effort, political will, and a willingness to learn from both the successes and the failures.
A long and winding road. It's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by this issue. But, we've seen throughout this deep dive that there are people and organizations out there working hard to make a difference. What can we learn from their efforts?
Yeah, their stories are really inspiring. They show us that change is possible, even in some of the darkest places. They highlight the importance of persistence, innovation, and believing in the possibility of redemption, whether it's advocating for policy changes, supporting rehabilitation programs, or just raising awareness. Every effort contributes to building a better future.
Yeah, their dedication is really inspiring. So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's leave our listeners with something to think about. What can we do to support positive change in Brazil and beyond?
Well, it starts with understanding. Educate yourself about this crisis. Have conversations about it. Challenge your own assumptions. You can support organizations that are working on the ground. And most importantly, remember this isn't just a Brazilian problem. It's a global challenge that needs a global response. By working together, I really believe we can create a world where everyone has the chance to live a life free from violence, poverty, and despair.
This deep dive has definitely taken us to some dark places, but it's also shown us that there's hope. There's this unwavering belief that a better future is possible. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving to make a difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey.